Hi folks, it's Dr. Paul Rose again. I'm coming to talk to you about waterfowl management, some of the different adaptations that ducks have and how we should keep them in captivity. And I'm going to give you a bit of information on their biology and their physiology, don't get angry, and how we should keep them healthy in captivity. My slightly angry friend in that introductory video was a mute swan. The mute swan is one of the most familiar and commonest of our waterfowl species, certainly here in the United Kingdom. And these mute swans on my local park are sharing their pond with the mallard, which is probably the commonest species of waterfowl, familiar to so many people and the ancestor of many domestic ducks. Both the mute swan and the mallard are in the order Anseriformes, and Anseriformes are the group of birds that comprise the ducks, geese, swans and the screamers. There are around about 180 species of Anseriformes, 3 species of screamer, which are an ancestral bird, and these are a relic, if you like, of the evolutionary history of the waterfowl and the game birds. In Europe, we call waterfowl wildfowl, because they were the wildfowl that people used to hunt. And wildfowl are an incredibly diverse group. They come in a range of colours, sizes, shapes, behaviours and evolutionary adaptations. So I'm going to go through some of these examples of species differences with you and why those differences inform husbandry. Let's start off by looking at the largest species. This is the trumpeter swan. It's the tallest and most statuesque species of the wildfowl. It's also got the largest wingspan. It's not necessarily the heaviest species, that is potentially the mute swan. Both the trumpeter swan and the mute swan vie for being one of the world's heaviest flying birds. Trumpeter swans come from North America. They're incredibly rare in the 20th century, but their population is now recovering. They're a relatively common species to see in animal collections, mainly because of their impressive size and the story that they tell of conservation success. Like all swans, the male and the female are not sexually dimorphic. You can't tell them apart. And they have an incredibly strong pair bond. It's always important to remember the strength of these pair bonds when keeping such territorial species in captivity. And the trumpeter swan has these enormous webbed feet, which it uses to spread its weight when walking on soft ground. Now let's go to the opposite end of the scale. This is a common teal, a bird that you can find wild here in the United Kingdom. Teal are amongst the smallest of all species of duck. In fact, the smallest species of dabbling duck is called the Hottentot teal from Africa. The smallest species of wildfowl overall is the African Pygmy goose, which is not a goose, but it is in fact a very small species of duck with a goose-shaped bill. Teal are sexually dimorphic, unlike the swans. This is a male. He's got this beautiful russet and green head, grey sides, and that lovely yellow triangle on his tail. The female, like many species of ducks, is cryptic, brown, or a camouflage colour, so that when she sat on eggs, she's unobtrusive. He will remain brightly coloured to reduce attention away from the female. And what about the screamers? These are very unusual birds. I often think they look like they've been put together by a committee. Their faces are quite like those of a raptor. They've got large chicken-like legs, broad wings, but they can swim. And they've also got large spurs on their carpal joints or wrists. You can see these spurs on the bird with the outstretched wings. They use these spurs for defence. The 3 species of screamer all come from South America. These in the photograph are southern screamers, the commonest you'll find in animal collections. But there are also 2 other species called the northern screamer and the horned screamer. Screamers are devoted parents and they have excellent pair bonds between individuals. They're not cold tolerant and they're prone to frostbite, so they must be provided with extra shelter and perching in the winter time. I've mentioned that in some species of wildfowl, the male and the female look different. They're sexually dimorphic. And for some species of dabbling duck, like these mallards, after the breeding season, the male undergoes a change of colour, and this is called the eclipse plumage. In this photograph, the bird at the front is a female. She keeps her cryptic brown colour all year round. Once she's safely on eggs and in a nest, the male will molt. He replaces all of his beautiful bright colours. Compare this bird to the mallards that you saw at the start of this presentation with their beautiful green heads and grey bodies. He has lost the ability to fly because all wildfowl molt all of their flight feathers at the same time. To reduce predation and to allow him to conserve energy and remain still and inactive during the molt, he will become brown and camouflaged like the female. Once the autumn arrives, he will molt back into his beautiful breeding colours. As you can see in this video taken over the winter is when wildfowl look at their best. Those that have molted through into their breeding colours will be showing off to the females, ready for courtship and breeding in the following spring. Wildfowl are synonymous with winter. In this clip you can see a bean goose, a white-fronted goose and a grey-lag goose. The bean goose and the white-fronted goose are migratory birds. They arrive in the United Kingdom in the autumn and winter to escape the harsher conditions of the Arctic tundra. And many species of wildfowl travel enormous distances to get here. Even species like the mallard and some populations of the grey-lag goose are also migratory. And what's going on in this example here? This white bird is a domesticated duck, a farmyard escape if you like. The mallard is the ancestor of most domestic breeds, apart from the Muscovy duck, and it also hybridizes very readily with other populations. So when we are breeding species, particularly those of conservation concern, we should try and remove the presence of mallards from our rarer birds to avoid any polluted bloodlines. Here is an example of a hybrid, which to me looks like a mixture of several species of widgeon. Widgeon are a grazing duck. We have a species native here to the United Kingdom, the European widgeon, and we also keep two exotic species quite commonly in captivity. The fact that wildfowl will hybridize so readily, as I've just mentioned, is important to captive collections and to conservation breeding. And it's been shown that hybridization out in the wild can really restrict populations. The threatened white-headed duck, a European bird, has had a population decline and reduction in viable breeding individuals because of hybridization with the introduced North American ruddy duck. So it's important that we do good population management when we keep wildfowl in captivity. And these are some exotic widgeon. These are Chiloe widgeon from South America in a bird collection. At first glance, all individuals might look the same, but they are subtly sexually dimorphic. The male bird right at the front, with the glossy green head, is standing next to a female whose colours are slightly dulled. Differences in the plumage of different species are important considerations for when we mix them together, because these are particular signals that different birds use as part of their social behaviour. Widgeon are a grazing species. They require short grass lawns where they collect lots of their food. So again, a nice example of the ecology of the bird being factored into animal management. And they're a social species too. They have strong pair bonds between the male and female, but they also like to live as a flock. Chiloe widgeon also make the best noise. They're so interested and so engaging. You've probably worked out that I am a real fan of wildfowl. There's just something about this group of birds that I find utterly charming. And if well kept and well looked after, they can live for a very long time in captivity. I've known geese to live well into their 30s, and I've kept ducks myself that have reached nearly 20 years of age. What I'd like to do now is introduce you to my own birds, talk a bit about the species that I keep, the reasons why I have them, and give you an insight into their management. I'm going to show you some practical tips for keeping captive wildfowl happy and healthy, and I'm also going to briefly discuss how to measure their welfare. What do the birds tell us? What do we provide them with? And how does their personality, as well as how they interact with their environment, provide us with an insight into their welfare state? So I've got several species of birds in this enclosure, and unfortunately they are being kept under cover at the moment because of the bird flu pandemic. So we've got to do indoor housing for our birds at the moment. So the bird at the front, he's Bruce. That's my red-breasted goose. And then behind Bruce, I've got my male Mandarin, and his wife is standing in the tray. And then I've got my two wood ducks, Ron and Nancy, named after the former president, and they are at the back. So one of the things that's really important to consider when we're looking at animal welfare is what condition the animals are in. We look at their plumage condition, we look at their eye condition, and we look at how well they walk and carry themselves. And we can do these types of animal welfare assessments visually by observation. So we can look at eye colour, and we can look at the brightness of eyes. We can look at the stance of the animal, and we can look at how it's interacting with its environment. We can look at how it interacts with others as well. Now you can obviously see that this is not their normal enclosure. Normally they would be out in a much wider space, but because of the avian influenza pandemic, we've had to keep the birds inside. So we still provide them with the same types of things that we would do normally. We've got lettuce, which is greenery for them to forage on, and we've got mealworms, which are their favourite treat. So we provide them with the same husbandry as they would get normally. They're just in a bit of a more restricted space. So let's think about what we can do from a welfare assessment perspective that we can then compare across individuals and populations, because we've obviously got different species that have got different needs in the wild, but there are things about them that we can compare. Here is Bruce and my female Mandarin on their pond in times when they were allowed outside. Bruce is obviously a goose, my Mandarin is obviously a duck. Different species with different anatomy and physiology, but they both have a natural affinity for water. So this is an example of a basic requirement that is the same across all of the 180 or so species of Anseriformes. If you keep wildfowl without access to clean bathing water, they will quickly lose the quality and waterproofing characteristics of their plumage. They will become musty, their feathers will look tatty, and they might even smell. You could also end up with birds with a condition called wet feather, whereby they don't oil themselves properly, their feathers become waterlogged, and consequently the bird can become chilled. You may also see eye problems in species that cannot have access to bathing water too. Like the widgeon I was talking about earlier, geese are also grazing species. In fact, it's the behaviour that takes up the majority of their time. So Bruce is provided with a short grass lawn for him to graze upon, and we provide him with vegetation at the moment whilst he's inside because of bird flu to enable him to perform that behavioural need. Red-breasted geese are a bird of the short grass tundra, and you can see that from the photo. Bruce has a very short stubby bill, so we manage the grazing that he has to make sure the grass length itself is not too long, so he can still mow the lawn as he would in the same way in the wild. But we also have to consider the needs of the other birds as well. So I have to look at their behavioural ecology and think about the furnishings of the enclosures that they too need. And this is particularly important when all animals are housed in together. So the wood ducks and the mandarins are perching species. They like to be off the ground. Here are some young wood ducks that I hatched a few years back, and you can see they are merrily perching in a flower pot. So I provide them with piles of logs and branches, and I also provide them with various platforms to sit on, which enables them to perform that same perching behaviour. The wood duck and the mandarin occupy a totally different ecological niche to Bruce, so there's no competition for particular resources. Providing you have an understanding of what the birds need, therefore you'll have an understanding of how they will get along. And that's really, really important when it comes to thinking about individual differences and personality traits that might affect animal welfare. For example,
are they interested in their environment? Have we got personality characteristics that we can use as well? So how do we go about understanding the individual differences of the birds as well as what they should do as a species? And that's obviously really, really important because individual differences in a captive population are essential to how well we look after them. Keepers know their animals really well, so we can have different personality measures.
And because wildfowl are so often kept in mixed species exhibits, like in this large collection of a whole range of species, individual personality and individual behavioural type are really important to note. Likewise, species might have a particular type of characteristic about their behaviour that's also important to understand. Some species might be quite shy and retiring, preferring to use a particular feature of the environment. They could be quite specialised in nature, easily bullied or outcompeted with other birds. Other species of wildfowl, like the classic Mallard Duck, are incredibly generalist. They're very confident and able to exploit a range of situations. So they might be the one doing the competing from the other birds, pushing out other quieter or shyer individuals, and therefore changes to the management, husbandry or enclosure might be needed to ensure that everyone gets along together. Here's a brilliant example of a species of wildfowl with a big personality. This is a wonderful species called a white-backed duck. It's incredibly aquatic, built like a little submarine, and it comes from tropical Africa. White-backed ducks are fearless in defence of their territory, their partner, their nest and their youngsters. They should only be carefully mixed with other species that are brave and bold enough to stand up to them. In fact, white-backed ducks generally do best in single species enclosures. By the way, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this is not a white-backed duck because its back is clearly orange and black. The white parts are hidden by its wings when they're folded. When the bird is flying, it has a vivid white patch between its wings. And I've already said that some species can be incredibly territorial. In this photograph, we have a group of wild mute swans. The resident male in this particular territory is in the top of the picture, and he's driving away 3 younger males. You must be very careful when you mix these large territorial species together. Swans particularly can be incredibly dangerous to other birds and have been known to drown birds that can't get out of their territory. Obviously in captivity, where we're managing populations, escape from such territorial individuals can be impossible. So always make sure you know your birds, know their behavioural characteristics, know their habitat requirements, and then you'll have the right evidence for the most appropriate mixed species exhibit.
So we can look, as I said, at personality of the individuals themselves, and we could look at scoring that particular personality. So we might be interested in what the birds look like, we might be interested in how they engage with their environment, and we might be interested in the things that they do with each other. Are they bold or shy? Are they exploratory? Who do they like to follow around? So we've got these different ways of being able to work out individual characteristics and what this actually means. So if we take Bruce, who's my red-breasted goose at the front, he's a relatively quiet animal, he's relatively steady, and he's really good with other birds because he's confident enough to give them confidence too. My mandarins are really confident. They like to know what's going on, and sometimes they like to throw their weight around with the other animals in the enclosure. So we need to think about that when we do species mixes. So not only are we considering the physical characteristics of the animals, we're also thinking about their personality characteristics too. So my ducks here are provided with all of the resources that they need, even though they're currently housed inside because of bird flu. So this is something that we have to do for all birds across the UK at the moment. We have to keep them inside if we can. But we're still providing them with the same access to resources. So we've got their trays of food and water. We've got a deeper bowl for them to be able to swim and splash in. And it's a legal requirement for ducks to be able to fully immerse their heads in water. So we can use that as a method of understanding animal welfare. And animal welfare is the state of the individual as it attempts to cope with its environment. So we really need to be thinking about not only measuring what's in the environment, but also what's being told to us by the birds themselves. And if we think about qualitative approaches and qualitative measures, we can look at this long-running trend in personality. Do birds or any individual animal show the same types of personality traits over time? Is that consistent within the individual? And if it stops being consistent, then we might know there are differences in how that animal is engaging with the environment, and consequently it might not be feeling like itself.
Of course, knowledge of the animals you're looking after is an essential skill for the keeper of any form of wild animal that they are in charge of. But when that wild animal is rare from a conservation perspective, or rare because it's not common in living collections, that knowledge becomes even more important. This incredibly beautiful bird is a Harlequin duck, and the Harlequin duck comes from fast-flowing streams and coastal areas around the coasts of Iceland. Harlequin ducks are not common in living collections, and they can be challenging to look after because of these very specific ecological needs that they have. Knowledge of what the birds should do, knowledge of how they interact with one another, and knowledge of their natural behaviour patterns can be really useful information in guiding what you would expect to see from such birds when you are housing them and keeping them in captivity. Likewise, species that are fully maritime, such as this long-tailed duck, are often known to come with a whole range of potential health issues when we keep them in captivity. The sea is a relatively clean environment, so such maritime ducks need very clean water, well filtered, well aerated, free from pathogens. Knowledge of how this bird looks normally, knowledge of what its plumage condition should be, and knowledge of its normal behaviour patterns are excellent ways of identifying a healthy bird, so that if any individuals do look off colour, veterinary intervention can be sought before problems get out of hand and before that might make a grave risk to the bird's life. So again, we're talking about the personality as well as the resources and the natural behaviour patterns of the individual bird being a really useful guide to the best practice care. And of course, this bird knowledge becomes even more important when those species are of conservation concern, like these swan geese, which are listed as vulnerable by the IUCN because they have ongoing population declines and loss of their overall range. Unsustainable levels of hunting have also pushed this species into the threatened categories. So if we are managing ex situ populations for the ARC paradigm, i.e. to keep the species safe if things are going wrong in the wild, we need to know our individuals really well, we need to know their requirements, and we need to be able to step in quickly in case of any health problems to ensure those individuals are provided with the best possible health care to make them better in the event of any disease situation.
We look across our population, we look at what the individuals tell us, and we look at how they're interacting with their environment. Are they using their resources properly? What's their personality characteristics? Can we accurately score their personality over time to make sure it's consistent for that individual? And if those consistencies change, do we have a problem? So because in a captive setting, we can get really close to our animals and we know their personalities well, this is a really good way of understanding animal welfare.
Welfare goes across the whole course of an animal's life, and this is a shameless excuse for me to show you some cute baby birds. These are a little flock of Mandarin Ducklings that my female Mandarin hatched in the summer of 2020. Aren't they adorable? I could sit and watch ducklings all day long. So the reason this is a nice example of good animal welfare is because what you can see in the video enables the birds to naturally develop the behaviour patterns that will be so important for them as adults. Ducklings are precocial. They look after themselves from when they're hatched. They only need their mother for warmth and shelter, and she points them in the right direction of suitable feeding locations. But they do the rest of the things themselves. So here we've got a shallow tray of fresh water that's ideal for ducklings to first take their swims in, and we've got some chopped up lettuce, which is excellent foraging material. Both the babies and the mother can enjoy this enrichment. She, by them watching her foraging activities, shows them how to forage more effectively, and they grow up and learn how to be successful adults. You will also notice that some of these ducklings are a bright yellow colour. This female mandarin had 2 albino birds in this clutch, which was quite a cool thing to see. So if you are breeding your birds, and if you are looking after youngsters, think about their welfare too, and provide them with the same levels of care as you would give their parents. Young birds will also benefit from environmental enrichment. It will keep them active, it will keep them healthy, and it will allow them to develop a whole range of natural behaviours that one day they will use as adults. And the best forms of environmental enrichment for ducks and for any animal are based on key facets of their natural ecology, key behaviour patterns that they would naturally perform in the wild. So we use enrichment to promote those behaviour patterns when we keep the animal in a living collection. Here's some great enrichment for diving ducks. Sinking food that means they have to collect that food in exactly the same way as they would in the wild. I like to think that this group of golden eyes looks a bit like a jacuzzi. And again, we come back to knowing your birds, knowing their species behavioural ecology. These are whistling ducks, another perching duck that's equally at home in trees as it is on ponds. But whistling ducks also like to dive, and these birds are collecting food from the bottom of their pond. In fact, in Australia, one of the species of whistling ducks is called the water whistling duck because of its natural affinity for swimming and diving. Use that knowledge of ecology, promote these behaviours using enrichment, and that will influence positive welfare. Don't forget the social environment too. I mentioned this before with the widgeon. The displays that many animals will put on as part of courtship are also really good forms of enrichment. And the reason why so many ducks are so highly sexually dimorphic is to provide a sexually selected signal from the male to the female. This encourages female mate choice, and it engages the males in male-to-male competition and display for the female's attention. Here you can see a large group of displaying mandarins. The males have these really large orange sail feathers, which they use to show off to the females and outcompete other males. So the performance of this behaviour and the diversity of actions that the mandarins are engaged in is enriching to the birds and improves their overall welfare state.
So if I just go back to my birds finally, you can see that the males are really beautifully brightly coloured and the females are dull and cryptic, and that's part of their natural ecology. And you can also see that Bruce, the goose, he is the same colour as he would be in a male and a female. So in some species we've got sexual dimorphism, and in other species we don't have sexual dimorphism, and that affects their behaviour and it affects how they will interact with resources. So we should be aware of the differences in behaviour based on natural ecology, and we should build that into our animal welfare assessment and what we provide to the birds or any animal that we're keeping. So I hope you found this useful, and so just to kind of finish off, I keep these birds for educational purposes. Because I do research on wildfowl, I find it really helpful to have my own birds to be able to use in scientific behavioural studies, as well as to develop husbandry measures as well. And particularly in the middle of a global pandemic, when we're trying to showcase the role of animals to behavioural study, to animal welfare study, and as an educational technique, they've been invaluable to my teaching throughout the pandemic. So from me and my ducks, I hope you've enjoyed this short presentation. I hope it's explained a bit to you about how we do animal welfare measurement at the individual level and at the population level, and I hope it's shown to you why we should consider personality and expression as well as interaction with resources. So thank you very much and have a really good day.